Thank you so much, Kai. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm happy to be here. Thank you, Marina, for trusting me with this panel. Mrs. Minister for Culture called unity and diversity here this morning the wings of democracy. What a beautiful picture or mental image. And Mr. Movkovtsev said that we seek balance between those two wings, which is, if you try to fly anywhere on one wing alone, you won't fly very far. So seeking a balance between your two wings, I think, is wise to the utmost. So it is a balance that we're seeking in our societies. It is also an agreement between the people in that society. And High Commissioner Kemp was here saying, or providing you the evidence that integration works. We also know that democracy works. Democratic countries have achieved the highest standard of living in the history of mankind. And yet we are here in this panel asking if democracy is but a dream. Or perhaps it's a societal choice. Like possibly many of you, or a number of you, I was born in an illiberal, non-free, non-democratic society. I was made to wear the symbols of that society on my school uniform, and I remember the bush on the street of my school where I took off the pin with Lenin's picture and sort of threw it into that bush, and then replaced it on my school uniform lapel with the Estonian flag. And these days I have issues with national patriotism too. But it's a dream that I've been pursuing sort of ever since. So I've been teaching argumentation and debate skills to people young people in schools. And that goes or follows the ideals, I should say, of Jürgen Habermas, that it is the strongest, best arguments that should prevail in society. And CitizenOS is an online decision-making portal that brings people together to make decisions. So I hope that you share this dream. I hope that the dream of democracy is not just a dream, but it is a shared dream here. But I'm also here in this panel to maybe be a little bit reconvinced or convinced again that it is really a societal choice, because a choice implies that there are multiple paths that we can take. That it is not a supranational zeitgeist that is taking us further from democracy. So let's find out. This is a panel, not about me, but about the people on the panel. This was just to get us warm to the topic. We will do this panel in a way where the panelists, some of them will have keynote presentations in the beginning, short ones to introduce us to the topic. And then we will be all in front of you and have the discussion, and hopefully involving all of you. The Slido question-asking opportunity is open. So let's listen to the opening statements of the panelists. The first to deliver her opening statement is Professor Zsuzsa Csergő. She's here all the way from Canada. She's the Sir Edward Peacock Professor of Nationalism and Democracy Studies in the Department of Political Studies at Queen's University, Canada. She specializes in the study of nationalism and contemporary challenges to democracy, with particular expertise on Central and Eastern Europe. Dr. Csergő is a general editor of the European Yearbook of Minority Issues, and she leads the Comparative Minority Institutions database. Please welcome Professor Zsuzsa Csergő.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be here, to be back, I should say, because I presented at one of the first Estonian Integration Foundation conferences, I believe in 2017. And I'm really happy to be back. But what a difference between the environment, the political regional environment in 2027 and today. But I'm going to start with something that I do sometimes when I introduce myself to my students in classes. My name was misspelled on the first slide. It's actually CSG. Zsuzsa is a Hungarian name, ZSUZSA. So it's Zsuzsa Csergő. And I'm going to start by saying that if I had to capture the current moment where we are today in 3 words, 3 concepts that are predominant in political science talk discourse today, I would choose the following: crises, nationalism, and democratic backsliding. These 3 will be at the core of my presentation. And I approach them through the lens of a trajectory about how we got to this moment, what it means to be here, and where we go from here. And when I say we, I mean the community of people who are interested in the sustainability of democracy, the kind of democracy that not only allows for diversity, but respects it, values it, and the one that creates governments that don't violate international norms. All of this seemed like a triviality even 5 years ago, but it's something that we need to remind ourselves of today, because there has been a series of crises since the late 2000s that have created an environment in which trust in the fundamentals of democratic government has really been tested. I've studied nationalism for a long time, so I'll start with an argument about nationalism, again, that is trivial in nationalism studies, but which is that something that needs to be told today, which is that nationalism and democracy can coexist, but they are in tension with each other. And especially majoritarian nationalism and democracy are in tension with each other. And although clearly nation states have been at the backbone of the international system for a long time, since World War II, and many of them have been democratic, and democratic nation states are not going away. They are a continuous work in progress. And we live at a time when the foundations of the link between majoritarian nation state and democracy have to be constantly nurtured. I've highlighted a few of the crises that everyone knows about. The financial crisis in 2008, 2009, which created cracks in the promises of marketization. Then the beginning of Russian irredentism in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, which created a major crack in the norms, fundamental norms of international society. Then the 2015 so-called European refugee crisis, which exaggerated perceptions of national insecurity and also created an opportunity for political leaders. Something is happening here that the slides are not proceeding. Okay. I see. Okay. So I mentioned 2014, then the 2015 so-called European refugee crisis, which also created an opportunity for political leaders to employ protectionist nationalism, to send the message that outsiders are enemies at our gate. Then came the 2019 COVID crisis, which reasserted the nation state more tangibly than any of the previous crises, amplifying boundaries between people, borders reappearing also within the European Union, also creating a sense that people could only count on national governments. And then, since the beginning of this year, mid-January 2025, with Donald Trump's return to the White House, with an explicit agenda to change the norms of appropriateness in the international system, which many call tectonic shifts in the international system of norms. So these together created uncertainties that weakened trust in institutions at a time when institutions are the most needed for security, predictability, and to give people some kind of time horizon for democracy, for the sustainability of democracy. And so it is not coincidental that majoritarian nationalism has been on the rise. But at the same time, this is not a natural development either, since the fundamental tension between majoritarianism and democracy is really recognized by political theorists. It's been recognized by political theorists since the 18th century. James Madison, for example, wrote in Federalist Number 10 in 1787 that measures are too often decided not according to the rules of justice and the rights of the minor party, but by the superior force of an interested and overbearing majority. Numbers can provide a sense of safety to those who belong to the majority, but if democratic rights are important, rights of freedom of expression, association, equal access to institutions and public resources, and so on, then the only way to deal with the tension between majoritarianism and democracy is to implement what Abizade, a political theorist in Canada at McGill calls counter-majoritarian institutions. Counter-majoritarian institutions that make it possible for a political community to emerge in culturally diverse societies. And of course, the possibilities and forms of counter-majoritarian institutions depend on context. In Canada, this is federalism. In other societies, there are minority policies that allow for national minorities to preserve their culture, to have institutions of their own. But the question that arises in this particular moment, in this very highly securitized environment, is whether counter-majoritarian institutions can be created and sustained in such environments. In other words, how does a highly securitized political environment shape the possibilities for democratic inclusion, especially in majoritarian states? How can we move beyond rhetoric about diversity to actually implement diversity? And what the current moment shows, what research shows, is that the way many political leaders in state centers respond to concerns of security is to turn to ethnic majoritarianism. And so I'm putting up there a quote from one of the most influential scholars of ethnicity and nationalism, Kanchan Chandra, who said this in a recently published article in the Journal of Democracy. I'm quoting, majoritarian nationalism has become a defining feature of 21st century democracy. And this is something that is also, it's an assessment, and it's also a warning sign. If we look at why ethnic majoritarianism has emerged as a defining feature, majoritarian nationalism promises something that's very valuable to state centers. It promises a comfortable core majority. This is, again, something that's recognized in the literature on nationalism. It is easier to maintain state stability if a state does not have persistent minorities that mobilize for special interests and claim institutions, especially without minorities that are associated with activist kin states. These are the types of minorities, and relationship between kin minorities, kin states, is again something that I have been studying for at least the last 15 years. It's easier to govern, says the logic of majoritarian nationalism. Easier to build unity of purpose, and purpose meaning also agreement, consensus on the kind of government, on the kind of society we want to be, on shared cultural affinities. This is the logic of it. And therefore, there is a strong appeal of ethnic majoritarianism. At the same time, choosing ethnic majoritarianism, which is a choice, it carries major risks if we are interested in sustainable democracy, if we want to avoid democratic backsliding. Evidence shows that ethnic homogeneity is no guarantee for democratic sustainability. Within just Central and Eastern Europe, what we have seen in the last 10, 15 years is that the political leaders that have been in the forefront of democratic backsliding are in countries that are among the most ethnically homogeneous in the region: Hungary, Poland. We can also start listing the Czech Republic here. So maybe we should start asking the question whether ethnic homogeneity is actually connected to democratic resilience. Democratic backsliding is definitely not a feature of multi-ethnic societies. It is a choice by political leaders who are adopting strategies to create it, while at the same time there is solid comparative research suggesting that ethnic minorities can in fact be advantageous for democratic resilience if the majority mainstream political leaders and organizations committed to democracy cooperate with them. A recently published book by Jan Rovný, Oxford University Press last year, makes precisely that argument, that where democracy requires reinforcement, actually ethnic minorities are structurally positioned to become what he calls circumstantial liberal allies of democracy defenders, of mainstream majority parties that defend democracy. Complementing Rovny's findings, the comparative research I have been engaged in since at least 2015 revealed that minority political actors are constant balancers. They strategize to have a seat at the table where the rules are decided, where public resources are allocated in the state center. And that minority voters are collectively rational. Their voting patterns show what I call collective rationality from a minority perspective. They vote for parties they perceive as minority friendly. And parties that are minority friendly tend to be the ones that stand for the kind of pluralist democracy that recognizes and values diversity. Not just cultural diversity, but also diversity within the core, ethnic core population. And secondly, that minorities also need not just allies among the mainstream majority parties and populations, but they need institutions. They need institutions that do the work that democracy theory and comparative literature on democracy has proven to matter for the resilience of democracy. The so-called intermediate organizations, the meso-level organizations in society, including what we call civil society organizations, NGOs, but all the spectrum of organizations, starting with municipal government, schools, media, organizations that create a network of institutions that uphold democracy. Because institutions are necessary to extend the political time horizon, to structure conflict, so that tensions that may not be visible today, but may burst if a minority population or a segment of society is marginalized and alienated. Without institutions, it can take ad hoc forms of mobilization. And institutions can channel that, institutions can prevent that, institutions can provide conditions that help prevent alienation from democracy and the state. So there is strong consensus in the literature on the significance of these institutions and the quality and stability of democracy. What matters also, what comes out from our research, the collaborative research that I have been doing for the last 7-8 years on minority institutions in Central and Eastern Europe, is that sustainable democracy requires organizations that foster both intra-minority bonding, institutions that are for minorities themselves, and also minority-majority bridging across social domains. And these are the institutions that require funding, public support, in order for them to create social resilience, without which alienation is very difficult to prevent. And so to circle back to the question that motivates this section of the conference, whether choice matters in the sustainability of democracy. The answer is obviously yes. It's an answer built on the work of scholars, theorists, and empirical scholars, those that I've highlighted, also on the research that I have conducted with collaboratively with colleagues in Central and Eastern Europe in a process that I would call a co-production of knowledge with local scholars, as well as on my experiences on 2 continents, having grown up as a minority person, a Hungarian in Romania, fleeing from the Ceausescu dictatorship in the late 1980s, becoming a political refugee in Austria and then the US, where I became a political scientist. Building upon all of this, the answer is that democracy is worth sustaining even at the risk of accommodating minorities. Achieving ethnic majoritarianism at the expense of democratic backsliding is not worth it. It's never worth it. And I'm going to end with a quote by John Lewis, who is an American, or was an American civil rights activist, who published this. Actually, it was published by the New York Times, an article, an essay by John Lewis on the day of his death. The title of the essay is "Together You Can Redeem the Soul of Our Nation." And the quote is, "Democracy is not a state, it is an act." What he does here, John Lewis, is he emphasizes the significance of choice and the significance of political agency. of political agency, which means essentially, in simple terms, the authority to decide about one's condition in life, about the rules by which we live and how we practice them. And I'm going to bring in another thinker, the Canadian political scientist, political theorist, Margaret Moore, who says, it is morally important, both important to individuals and morally valuable in an objective sense, that individuals have control over the collective conditions of their lives and control in the relationships that give meaning to their lives, including their relationships with each other and with place. And so the choice, I believe, today, in this current moment, is between nationalism and democracy. And if you ask me, I'll choose democracy every time. Should I sit here?
You can if...
Or go back?
But I think it might be...
Okay.
So, our next speaker in this session is Dr. Marina Nord. Dr. Nord is a postdoctoral researcher at the V-Dem Institute at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, and she is one of the authors of the V-Dem Institute's annual democracy report. Her research focuses on explaining autocratization and democratization processes, sources of democratic resilience, as well as interplay between economic processes and regime transformation. Please welcome Dr. Marina Nord.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be here today. And I come from the V-Dem Institute, and for those of you who don't know, we are located at the University of Gothenburg, and we produce the largest data set on democracy in the world. And we do it with the help of experts. Experts are located in each country for which they are experts, so it's not people who are sitting in Sweden who decide how democracy in each country is rated. So people who decide on democracy in Estonia will be people who are located in Estonia. We have more than 4,000 experts, and we aggregate the data then using supercomputers and statistical model in Sweden. And the data runs on an annual basis. So the data that we have right now is only up to the end of 2024, because 2025 is still ongoing, and the data for that will be collected only in January 2026. And then when we present all the data, when we collect all the data, we aggregate it, and then we produce democracy report. Usually it is published in mid-March. And today for this presentation, I wanted to pick up a couple of facts, both from the democracy report and also from the research that we are doing at the V-Dem Institute, to explain what's happening with democracy in the world and how we should think about democratic resilience nowadays. So, fact number one is that the global level of democracy continues to decline. Here is some evidence for that. By country averages, we are now back to 1996. But that means that you would give the same weight to every single country in the world, and then countries like Seychelles will be weighted the same way as countries like India. If you use population-weighted averages, and this is in terms of how many people in the world enjoy democratic rights and freedoms, we are now back to 1985. And 1985, this is just to put things into perspective, this is the year when Gorbachev came to power in the Soviet Union. This is way before the end of the Cold War, even before the Reykjavik summit, when the discussion happened between Gorbachev and Reagan about the end of the Cold War. By territory-weighted averages, and this is in terms of how much of the world territory is now governed democratically, we are back to 1986. And the largest decline is happening by GDP-weighted average. This is how much democracy is now losing in terms of economic power. By that measure, we are at its lowest point in more than 50 years, and that's, the threshold was hit in 2019, and it continues to decline. So why we use 4 different measures? Because it tells us it's not only that democracy is declining, but this decline in the world is largely driven by countries that are large, populous, and economically powerful. So it's not tiny island nations that are declining on democracy. In Democracy Report, we quite often talk about population-weighted averages, and this is what you often see cited in the media, because we think of democracy as the rule of the people. And this is why, for the world as such, it matters how many people in the world enjoy democratic rights and freedoms. The second fact is that dictatorships are on the rise. Again, some evidence for this, and you see these are 4 types of regimes. This is how the numbers of regimes were changes during the last 50 years. And you see that close autocracies, this is harsh dictatorships. 50 years ago, they were the most common regime type in the world, and then they were rapidly declining in numbers for many decades, and they are now rapidly rising in numbers again, 35 as of 2024, and now more than liberal democracies. So these are harsh dictatorships. The third fact is that we now have more autocracies than democracies in the world. Again, the same number, but if you sum up, and this is for the first time in the 21st century, we now have 91 autocracies and 88 democracies. This threshold was hit again like in 2024 during the super year of elections. The fourth fact, and then the other thing that we also have is that it's even worse if you look by the world population. It's not only that we have more democracies than autocracies than democracies, but it's 72% of the world population now live in some type of autocratic regime. Because as I said, countries that are declining, they are mostly populous countries. The fourth fact is that this trend has been going on for at least 25 years. Again, some evidence for this. This is in terms of how many countries by numbers were democratizing and autocratizing and each year. The blue line, the blue dotted line is the number of democratizing countries, and you see that 30 years ago, it was 71 countries at the same time were democratizing. This was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Berlin Wall. This was the year when Francis Fukuyama wrote The End of History, because we thought that liberal democracy will be the eventual point for every country in the world. And then the moment we integrate all countries and trade, this is how they will democratize. And then only several years after that, by the end of 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, the number of autocratizing countries, the one that are either sliding back or already autocratic and becoming harsh dictatorships, they started to rapidly rise in numbers again. And in 2024, it's 45 countries, and that is only for countries that are ongoing. It doesn't include countries like Turkey, where this process has already stabilized, it has already established a stable autocratic regime. Again, by population weighted, you see that 45, 20 years ago, 12, but by population, 38% of the world population now live in a country where the situation with democratic rights and freedom is getting worse. Compared to these, for democratizing countries, you see it's 19, but it's only 6% of the world population. And again, why we so much talk about population-weighted average, because one of the countries that is democratizing, for example, is Seychelles. The other is one, Fiji. But on the other hand, you have among autocratizing ones countries like India. So the wave of autocratization has been going on for at least 25 years, and at the moment we don't see any signs of crescent. The fifth fact is that it is a global trend. Again, the map to show it's shades of red, it means countries where a situation is getting worse. Shades of blue, the situation is getting better. And the purpose of showing this map is just to show that this is happening everywhere. It's not that any specific region of the world is affected more than the other. And this is by the end of 2024, because as of 2025, this map looks like this. The third wave of autocratization has now reached the United States. We still don't have quantitative data for this because 2025 year is not, we still don't have the data for 2025, but we already know that this is happening over there, and it's happening very rapidly. The sixth fact is that we have an alarming loss of freedom of expression. Just to exemplify, we have over 600 indicators in the V-Dem data set. Here are the top 20 that are affected. And on the x-axis, you have the number of countries where a substantial and statistically significant decline is registered. 9 of the 20, top 20, different aspects of freedom of expression. The most affected one is government censorship effort of the media. It's declining in 45 countries of the world. This is a quarter of all countries in the world. The second most affected indicator, this is shared freedom of academic and cultural expression. This is attacks on universities, researchers, museums, attempt to rewrite the narrative and the history, and also civil society repression. But also you see harassment of journalists, media bias, and all that. This is declining in many, many countries of the world. The seventh fact is that deliberation is also decreasing. And deliberation, it's about to what extent you explain, politicians explain and engage society into the decision-making process, the capacity for dialogue. Again, the same graph, but here I want to point attention, this is engaged society decreasing in 33 countries in the world. And this, we are talking only about substantial and statistically significant decline. This is what you see on this graph. So marginal declines are not included there. Reason justification, the extent to which politicians explain their decisions to the general public, and also range of consultations, to what extent decision makers consult with the civil society and with the general audience before they introduce any policies. Again, this is declining in many, many countries in the world. The eighth fact is that, and this has already been mentioned here, that disinformation and polarization are on the rise, and it's not only this, but we also know from data that they forward autocratization. Here for averages, government disinformation, political polarization, red color means the country is also autocratizing, and you see that for averages, when government disinformation goes up, political polarization goes up, country is autocratizing. The opposite is also true. Government disinformation goes down, political polarization goes down, country is democratizing. Another graph that shows this, left-hand side, government disinformation, right-hand side, political polarization. This is for the last 10 years. And the way you should read this graph, if you are above the diagonal line, that means the situation has gotten worse during the last decade. And if you are red, it means that country is also autocratizing. Here you see Russia, also the government disinformation, almost to the maximum, but also Belarus, but also many other autocratizing countries like Hong Kong, Myanmar, Serbia, Philippines. Here with political polarization, if you are in the upper right corner, approximately here, that means that political polarization has reached toxic levels. And toxic levels, it means that you start to talk about your political opponents as your enemies, enemies of who we are, enemies of our way of doing, enemies that need to be attacked and destroyed. It's no longer about solving the problem or any kind of problem in the discussion in the society. It's about attacking and winning the other side. You see, we have also the United States in this level, toxic level of polarization. It's no longer about finding the consensus. It's no longer capacity for dialogue. Half of all autocratizing countries are increasingly spreading disinformation. You see here, a quarter of all countries in the world are increasing in political polarization. We even have, and half of all liberal democracies are increasing in political polarization. And this is one of the few facts that we can show that even Sweden reached here, but also Germany with AfD, and this is the countries where still democracy is untouched, institutions are stable, but polarization is already, this is a risk for democracy. Another fact is how it develops over time. One of the top 10 countries where the autocratization has already happened during the last 20 years. And this is just to exemplify how it develops over time. Government disinformation goes up, political parties' hate speech goes up, political polarization goes up, and liberal democracy index goes down. So this is where this process has already happened. The ninth fact is that autocratization has consequences. It has many consequences, but the one that we speak quite often right now is the consequence for security. And this is one of the few facts that we know from the research with almost 100% probability, is that democracies do not fight wars with each other. We usually talk about probabilities, but this is like an iron law in social science, one of the very few that we have. It goes back to Immanuel Kant, but it has been proven with hundreds and hundreds of different research papers. And you hear here electron constraints and vertical, the level of democracy, and the probability of an armed conflict. Here it's almost zero if you're a liberal democracy, but the moment you become to autocratize, and here just to exemplify, this is with Russia, this is where Russia was in 1995, and this is 2021, shortly before it invaded Ukraine. The probability of an armed conflict has more than tripled. So from the research perspective, we know that had Russia stayed as democratic as it was in 1995, it would not have invaded Ukraine. And then the final fact is that autocratization can be stopped and reversed. And we started to deal with this in Democracy Report in 2023, 2 years ago, and at that moment we knew about 8 cases where this was happening, where this fight for democracy continued. And then we started to deal with this systematically. And a research paper, one is now published in Democratization, where we analyzed the last 125 years in all cases where it happened. But we also have a policy brief. It's a 3-page summary for the general audience about what we know from the research so far about those cases. And we know that historically, roughly half of all episodes of autocratization were reversed within 8 to 10 years, approximately the duration here 8, and then the reversal started approximately around 5 years, which is 1 electoral cycle. So it was very hard for many of them to survive for more than 1 electoral cycle, 52%. And now we started to think about it as 3 different types of resilience. And the one that we often want to achieve as democratic resilience, onset to resilience, avoid those situations altogether, so not to allow people like Trump come to power in the first place, but this is very hard to achieve. And breakdown resilience, where some attempt to grab power happens, but it's stopped relatively quickly before democracy breaks down and democracy survives, and then bounce back resilience is the ability for democracy to recover after a crisis, after a short period of autocratization. And just to give a sense of how often it happens, breakdown resilience is not common, only 11%. So the majority, when autocratization starts, the majority of democracies break down, at least for a short period of time. The most common type of resilience is bounce back resilience, is ability to recover after a short period of crisis. And just to give a sense here, a stable autocracy, this is during the last 30 years, only 35% of attempts to autocratize establish a stable regime. Here are examples of countries where it happened. Turkey is one of those that managed to establish a stable autocratic regime after autocratization. Brazil, the one that's managed to survive an attempt to grab power. But the most common one is now Zambia, is where you have to fight. So there is a short period of autocracy, and then democracy is reestablished. And I stop here, and thanks for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, but please don't leave. Let's now take a seat. I'm inviting Zsuzsa also back on stage, so if you could join us. And as a third person, I am inviting you to welcome Professor Stefano Braghiroli, who is an associate professor of European Studies at the Johan Skytte Institute of Political Studies here in Estonia, in University of Tartu. And his research focuses on party politics in the European Parliament, EU politics, Euroscepticism and populism, and comparative politics. Stefano, you haven't had a chance to say your opening statements yet, so if you could say a few words from your research as well.
Yes, thank you so much. And again, since I don't have slides, I enjoy giving my 10 minutes thoughts from a very comfortable chair. So first of all, thanks a lot to the organizer for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be here. In these opening words, I will try to look a little bit at the mechanism, a triangulation basically that consists of the interlinkage between polarization, decline in societal cohesion, and democratic erosion, which is something that, let's say, the 2 previous speakers already start to explore, both with data and somehow with, let's say, looking back at the academic and analytical thinking. Now, why is it relevant? Well, first of all, because it is happening now. I mean, democracies are very much eroded and are very much in crisis, as you just show. And the second thing is that there is also a quite heavy potential for hijacking by hostile actors, both inside and outside. So in these 10 minutes, I will basically look at 3 things. First of all, the impact that polarization has or might have on democracy. The second one is I will try to look at lines of divisions that characterized advanced plural democratic societies and how that somehow relates to polarization and to democratic resilience. And the third one, I will try to put on the table some ideas on how to break this vicious circle. So the first thing that I would like to start with is basically with the interlinkage between democracy and polarization. And I mean, Zsuzsa has already put on the table quite a bit of discussion about how we connote democracy. So again, there are many definitions of democracy, many aspects that we want to shed light on. But I think that for the sake of this conversation, we can just simply think of democracy as relations between smaller or bigger groups of people that interact and then debate and exchange ideas. This somehow is what keeps democracy alive, not just as a theory, but as a practice. So when we think of democracy as representation of ideas, we can think of the moments in which these ideas interact, such as elections, but even referenda, or even, let's say, the democratic synthesis, as exactly the point in time in which preferences that are carried out by different groups compete and are basically translated into preferences. Let's say votes, for example. And in a way, let's say, when we come to the days of choosing, we can see some of these ideas succeeding, some others not, and somehow, again, this might evolve over time. So to some extent, circulation, exchange, and variation of ideas and preferences are, let's say, key for democracies to work. Again, and what it also guarantees is that ideas somehow that might prevail today might somehow be overcome by others tomorrow, and somehow, let's put it this way, if we think of democracy as groups interacting, one group should not always be satisfied, one group should never always be disappointed. And now I would like to bring on board some thoughts from a book that I really recommend to everyone, especially if you want to understand how democracy declines and how democracy is threatened. It's a book written by two scholars, Ziplat and Levinsky, during the first Trump mandate, but looking at the experiences of democratic erosion far beyond the United States. It doesn't have a particularly optimistic title, How Democracies Die. And basically, in order to look at how democracy works and how to make it work, both at citizens level and at elite level, they basically identify three main points. The first point is the use of restraint. So basically, not to use the power of the systems to the limits. Again, things, for example, of abuse of impeachment or, let's say, overstretch of institutional rules. The second one is importance in certain macro decisions, again, rules of the games or long-term decisions, to find the middle ground, to find consensus across ideological lines. And the third one is basically the idea that we compete, ideas compete, people compete over ideas, but we are not enemies. I mean, the enemy logic was brought in the conversation. And I think this is something to bear in mind. Disagreement does not and should not equal right or wrong. Now, how does polarization work in society? Well, we know that it crystallizes division, it reduces circulation of ideas, and to some extent turns ideas almost automatically into identities and crystallized identities. So if you widen the scope from, let's say, society to politics, what you basically see is that these divisions travels from society to politics. And you also see somehow that this goes very much to hijack these 3 points that Ziplat and Levinsky highlight. So first of all, instead of exerting restraint, what happens is that once in power, the winner and the ones who follow the winner, because again, as I said, the levels are two, citizens and elites, try to abuse the system to remain in power. It's legitimate. Why? Because somehow the other side is more and more a sort of enemy, so the enemy logic prevails. And the third point is, of course, that if you think in terms of consensus and cross-partisan agreement, I mean, we have seen that, let's say, with Vice President Mike Pence, we see it pretty much in a lot of examples that are framed as ideological betrayal. So what does it tell us in terms of democratic game? Well, as a result of this, democracy is understood less and less as a repetitive game with alternative outcomes and alternative winners, but increasingly as an absolute rule of a majority. And the absolute rule of a majority because the ones who rule, the ones who win, and the ones that are part of that group, considered part of the group, they think of that as the only possible way. Now, the second layer that I would like to add is the one that deals with lines of division. Lines of divisions that are quite common in complex, diverse societies. Again, here I borrow a concept from a quite well-known Norwegian political scientist of the 60s, cleavages. Again, cleavages can be basically understood in very basic terms as binary lines of divisions that characterize, as I said, complex societies. Again, cleavages can reflect social, political, economic, or cultural lines of divisions that divide citizens within a society into groups that might carry different interests and also different views and different ideas. Now, traditional cleavages, the ones that basically Steinrocken identifies, and I think all of us who have been dealing with political studies have been encountering from early age, deal with owners, workers, urban versus rural, church versus state, center versus periphery. Now, other cleavage might relate to, I don't know, environment, individual rights, how we see a society, economy, sport, and might vary also quite a bit from context to context. Now, since cleavages normally represent binary choices, when more than one cleavage meet the other, and that happens basically daily, they might overlap, so one over the other, or they might cross-cut. Now, let's think in political terms, again, in very general and basic terms. Think how, for example, conservative views on gender roles might, for example, in many contexts, relate to strong church attendance. Or how skepticism towards vaccines might relate to low trust in government. Or even how some progressive views might relate to something that sounds more innocent, I know, certain music preferences. Again, they might, but they do not have to basically overlap in that way. And how does this relate to polarization? If more than one cleavage, more than one line of divisions overlap, what they do, they strengthen the existing divisions. And basically widen the gap between two alternative groups. So in the end, you still have always more and more these two alternative groups, and every time you add one line of division, that multiplies the effect. Instead, if lines of division cross-cut each other, they basically tend to dilute their binary nature, and they tend to blend in a more diverse society that basically is formed by multiple rather than two groups. And this is basically about reducing polarization. Now, one consideration I would like to bring in is if we think in terms of groupings. Zsuzsa, let's say, brought on the table this idea of bonding and bridging. So basically, this relates very much to the title of our meeting today, Unity and Diversity. Bonding basically is about developing strong ties within an homogeneous group. And basically, the idea is that it really supports a strong sense of belonging and strong sense of community, of us. Bridging, it's about weaker ties between diverse groups, but provides what? Let's say, provides perfect ground for circulation of ideas, and also provides access to resources, opportunities, contacts. Both are necessary. But too much of one or of the other might be harmful to societies. And I really would say that, when it comes to, again, the other part of at least of today's panel that we are having here, choice or dream, certainly this relates very much to choice. In a way, we are the ones, both as societies, as individuals, and who leads the society, that can decide and discuss on the balance between bonding and bridging and this. And last thought, again, this is about us. We are not spectators in this game. We really should not be spectators, because if we are spectators, then we easily become victim of that game. But again, we can think of that in very different levels. And I just throw 3 ideas. One is about, level of education. Think of civic education. Think of engagement. Think basically of bringing people of diverse background together. Again, Habermas already popped up in today's conversation. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is this beautiful idea of constitutional patriotism. So the idea that we belong to a community not because of Blut und Boden, not because somehow of blood and roots, but because we share what we have. But also, for example, working at the institutional level, reinforce internal democracy in parties to avoid, for example, ultra-leaderism, which very much undermines normally democratic life inside parties. Institutional settings. I mean, electoral laws, or even, let's say, majorities to decide things that are rules of the game. And 2 things. I mean, I think, for example, one interesting dynamic that we have, for example, in the Swedish parliaments, and as far as I know in other Scandinavian parliaments, the fact that representatives do not sit in terms and along their political and ideological label, but according to the region they come from. Because the idea is that somehow they should work together for that region and for that context. And I think, yes, maybe I can stop here. And thanks a lot again.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, so we have a little under half an hour now to start the discussion, which hopefully will carry through lunchtime and further through the conference. I want to pick up on the point that I started this panel with, which is whether it is a real societal choice, whether democratic resilience is a real societal choice. Now, Zsuzsa made a great case that within a country it is. There's evidence to support this. And when I looked at Marina's data, it clearly showed a sort of a global wave of autocratization going on, even though there are single examples of either bounce back or countries defying that trend. And I know some of you sort of mentioned Estonia in positive light, but we're having big challenges here in Estonian society as well. So my question is, and I also very much agree that we shouldn't be bystanders or even sort of victims of a process that in sort of how we should approach this is definitely a sort of hands-on or wanting to affect change position. However, what I'm wondering is, what in your research or in your thinking proves or shows that it is an actual choice in countries? And what I mean by this is, if in comparison we would look at this autocratization or non-resilience or democratic backslide as a sort of a global phenomenon where one marble hits the other, hits the other, hits the other, and it's a country like Estonia or a country like Canada might, within its own borders and within its own politics, strive to be the exception and make the right choices, but the overall zeitgeist is so much against democracy that regardless of our good intentions, it isn't actually a choice. It is something that is happening globally because of the ongoing crisis, because of the security environment, the multi-crisis. Everybody knows this. How is this a real choice? It can be, but how is it an actual choice for countries?
Do you want me? So let me start with this political scientist take on it, that one of the major debates, ongoing debates in the field has been about the question of whether structures, institutions are constraining our more than what our agency can give us. So is it are structures pushing us in various directions, or how much agency do we have? And so this is a question about that. And when we talk about these waves of democratization, wave of autocratization, of course this question comes up. And so one of the things that autocrats do is to atomize society, to prevent people from becoming collective actors. And collective actors are those people who are clusters of various kinds in society that can engage in collective action, which is always more than one individual doing something. And so this we know from literature on dictatorships and autocracies. So what people can do is to continue engaging in organizations, in organized waves of life. And of course, I've been studying the meso-level institutional sphere, so what we see is that those really matter. So people, even when there is polarization politically, and there are all kinds of crises that motivate policy making in the state center, sometimes what you hear is that people say, but there's no conflict on the ground. Well, the reason why there is no conflict on the ground is that people live their lives where they live, in everyday society, in everyday life, in a village, in a town, in a city, and that's where they engage in social life. Kids spend most of their days in a school, and so on, right? So those are what really matters. So I think that my answer to that is collective action, not in the sense of millions of people gathering in one place, but in those, in organized ways.
It's a very hopeful message to those conference participants that are responsible for those kinds of organizations as well.
Yes.
Okay. When we looked at the data, and then again, as I showed, one needs to distinguish like at which stage you are. So like if you're already in the United States, it's a different story what you can do, compared to places where like if you're in Estonia, where this is still not happening. But what we see is that capacity for dialogue should be there. And the reason why I'm saying, like, if you're already at these toxic levels for polarization, there is no dialogue anymore. So it will be a different story. For countries that are still not there, dialogue is essential. And those countries that managed to reverse this trend were the ones that managed to unite opposition against an autocratized leader. And to unite opposition, you need to be in a dialogue with each other, to hear each other's opinions, and still to be able to put something that is bigger than the idea that we want to preserve democracy. And in that countries, and I'm thinking about countries like Poland, for example, where this opposition was united against an attempt to autocratize. And this was an attempt to unite opposition, mass mobilization, and again, for this you need dialogue within the society and civil society to go to fight against an attempt against wannabe dictators. And then, of course, it's also fighting disinformation, and for this you need civil society actors who will do the fact-checking. But for this, again, you need trust, and this is another thing that has been mentioned here, and this is possible only if social cohesion is there. But once you're already there and these toxic levels of polarization, how to get out of there, this is unfortunately a very different story.
Yes, thanks a lot. I think this question goes very much, let's say, at the core of our conversation. Maybe I will make 3 points that to some extent intersect with what has already been said. The first one is to understand that for political elites, I mean, not all of them, but, obviously for, let's say, political entrepreneurs that don't care much about, the good, the public good, the res publica, and more to their own good, in a way, this sort of dynamics, polarizing society, playing on culture wars, it's very much an easy way to gain consensus without solving problems. That's certainly something that, let's say, we should bear in mind. Doesn't mean that we shouldn't have trust in political elites, but we should keep in mind that that is an easy way when you don't have a solution to kind of, mobilize, polarize, and antagonize the society. That's the first thing. The second one is, as you already said, I really think that the key secret is, as far as is possible, even in extreme contexts like the US, try to talk to the other side. Try to talk to the other side because to some extent, by talking to the other side, you might break those lines of division. So as I said before, as far as I feel that all my preferences are opposite to the other side, it's very difficult to find points of contact. Now, let's find those non-political points of contact. My last point about the lines of division was, for example, let's say, music or sport. You know, really, or try to reach out your community member that might think very different in terms of politics, but might have similar preferences with you. You might find out that, you know, when you start talking about things that are not sport or sport or music, you might agree that, yes, something is rational on that side and something is rational on the other. Let's try to find solution. The moment in which there is no common neutral ground is where basically, again, these become crystallized identities and the enemy logic prevails. The last one is not lose hope. And by not lose hope, I will use basically a more, let's say, technical term. Do not feel disengaged. Do not give up. Because the moment in which you give up, the moment you are not, let's say, active, you do not want somehow to contribute, even if it looks bleak, even if it looks dark, basically we have already lost. Because we leave basically the voice, we leave the decision in the hands of the ones who don't care. So I think that this is fundamental, to kind of, you know, not lose hope and try and keep being active as citizens.
But Marina now again raised the topic of trust, and Zsuzsa before said that creating and sustaining counter-majoritarian institutions is sort of one of the keys. However, in the security environment that we're in, you know, to put it bluntly, people are afraid. They're afraid for their economic welfare, but these days they're also, you know, in a way afraid for their lives or their physical freedom. So, and we're seeing this happening in Estonia too, where on the one hand, it would be really helpful to listen to minority opinions and have groups speak out about problems too. But even some of those people in those minority groups are afraid to speak up because they will either be labeled as proponents of Moscow rhetoric or even worse, Russian disinformation might actually start using them, even though their first, what they were doing was expressing their honest problems or honest disagreement. So in the environment, like, crises aren't going to go away. Maybe, hopefully, we can end a war or two, but we're all on a spaceship which is ecologically suffering. So crises are not going to go away. In the crisis situation, what can we collectively as societies do to create and bolster and keep those institutions that help democratic resilience? Because I think it's an instinct for people. If things are dangerous, if I feel danger, I clamp down.
If you want, I can start.
Yeah,
well, I think that, of course, society and institutions can make a difference, can create fertile ground, but here I really think to a very large extent is also responsibility of politics. And I mean, I know that here when we speak, I mean, we have, let's say, politics broadly speaking, and I know after we will have politics broadly speaking, yes. Let's say, and not even broadly speaking, but, you know, yes. I think that in times in which democracy is besieged, in times in which democracy is under threat from outside, I mean, obviously, let's say, we have growing authoritarian and autocratic powers that are kind of, you know, sticking together. Again, obviously, we see how they are devastating, how Russia is devastating Ukraine. But the main objective here is, you know, undermining liberal democracy. That is the main enemy. And I would say that for citizens to feel that regardless of how harsh the situation is and how big are the fears, it makes sense to stand for that little thing that you don't eat, which is called democracy, you need to connect democracy to something to protect. So the point is that what I'm saying is that citizens should appreciate, and politics should make citizens appreciate features of democracy for which it is worth standing, for which it is worth, let's say, fighting. Again, be it, for example, let's say, the fact that you have certain freedoms, and you might lose those freedoms. You don't think about that today, but somehow together with the water, you throw away also the baby, and so on and so forth. But that also implies that political elites also have a certain degree of empathy with their voters. So as you said, if there are concerns of economic nature, for example, if there are concerns, for example, of being someone left behind, I think especially in times of crisis, in times in which we have so many threats, it's important for political elites to say, look, we can do as much as this, but we are trying to take care of you, because the moment in which you don't feel taken care, the moment in which you feel left behind, that is the moment in which you are not able and willing to stand for that democracy which is under threat from external outsiders, and then our democratic resilience declines. So while we know that, of course, resources are limited, we know that somehow what can be put on the table, not only in Estonia, but everywhere, is, let's say, maybe not as much as we would, I also think it is important not to make specific groups or specific set of people to feel systematically left behind, because that is exactly what undermines democracy.
Marina?
I wanted to pick up on three things while I was writing. First, the word that's stuck in my mind is the word like afraid. And this is the discussion that we had yesterday with Wolfgang also, who will give us a lecture, is that the moment, like even if institutions are functioning well enough, but the moment you start to be afraid to speak up and raise the voice against that something is not okay, this is the moment when democracy starts to erode. Because it starts with the erosion of norms in the society. You shouldn't be afraid. Even if it's by law you're allowed to do something, but this is kind of something is not okay if you're already afraid to raise something. The second thing that I wanted to point is that the word accountability hasn't been mentioned here, because you have talked quite a lot about what leaders should do, but leaders should be accountable to the citizens in the first place. And that means that we shouldn't just wait for the political leaders for us to engage us in the dialogue. We should really, as citizens, but also as civil society actors, to hold them to account, to make them accountable towards their actions. And if some wrongdoings are there, and it's in human nature to think about misusing power once you're in power, then civil society should stand up. So we shouldn't just leave it for the political decisions, political leaders to decide what's happening in between elections. We should really work as civil society also, as citizens of the nations against it. And the third point is that, again, maybe a little bit feminist, but from the data that we have, we see that parliaments, and also the moment you have more women in parliaments, they are more resilient in general, because women seem to be more able, especially when there is a lot of polarization in the society, to drive this dialogue, even to find a compromise between different sides. So engage women into politics. This would be my answer to this, because they are more able to negotiate.
Yes. I don't know what new to add to this, but one of the issues that have come up is disinformation, which brings us back to the centrality of information and knowledge. And one of the crises that we have not mentioned is the epistemic crisis, the crisis of trust in knowledge, trust in expertise, trust in the fact that that there is a difference between truth and non-truth. And that is something that is also occurring right now with leaders in power in very significant influential countries, such as the United States, who are attacking truth and who are eroding people's trust in, in expertise. And I think this is something that is not easy to fight against, but it's very significant to fight against, to keep up the production of expertise. And it's almost surreal that we have to say these things, that it's becoming a courageous act to say that this is a fact, this is the truth. And it's not relative. I mean, your opinion and someone else's opinion on whether there is a decline of democracy around the world are not the same, because you have studied it, and someone else who says that, well, I think these are not the same. And unfortunately, there is a crisis of trust in expertise and truth, and this is also significant. This is also a building block of democracy and something that needs to be protected. And I think that, yes, experts have to be out there and be also public intellectuals. And it's courageous, but to go out there and say the truth about society and about who drives polarization, for example.
I have one more quick question, but I think you have a comment to what
just a micro thought. I mean, one thing that, of course, also makes these things more complicated in terms of recognizing dynamics and also, again, truth when there are, is that simply, you know, as you have shown when it comes again to the data of V-Dem, you know, some 20, 30, or even earlier years ago, it was much easier to, let's say, distinguish democracy from non-democracy. Let's say, to a very large extent, I mean, you know, the ideal type of authoritarian leader, you know, makes a coup, takes power with the tanks and so on, is, at least in this part of the world, in what we understand, let's say, as Western extended world, a thing of the past. Nowadays, basically, autocrats depict themselves, let's say, as the absolute democrats, and basically empty democracy, keep the shells, and basically undermine it from inside. So that's why it's also much easier to play with lies and turn them into realities.
Okay, I want to open one more idea up because that's all we have time for. The title of this section said dream or societal choice. Now, we've been talking about the societal choice. We haven't been talking about the dream. Human beings are the kinds of creatures that follow a dream. So Isaac Asimov had to write about satellites, and then 40 years later, someone created the satellites. And I was listening the other day to an interview with a person who was a nuclear submarine captain during the Cold War. And he was describing, very honestly, it felt like, how they were there under the ocean for weeks on end because they were defending liberal democracy. Quote unquote, that's what he said. A nuclear submarine captain. So it is, I think at the time it was, in the liberal part of the world, democracy was something that people dreamed of extending and very much believed in. Where are we today? Is your research looking into, or is it important at all to the democratic resilience research about whether people still dream of democracy or want democracy? We've been inviting young leaders to Estonia to do sort of democracy workshops, and I've been working with countries like Indonesia and Myanmar. And what we find is that they know the word, but they have very, very little understanding of what the concept is. And when they go away from these extended workshops, then they have really started thinking about how to create that in their communities. Is this, does this figure in the research as an important aspect in some way?
Of course it does. There are, so attitudinal surveys are probably the most common ways of trying to tap into this. I do want to add a more of a personal story here as well, that I mean, two sides of it. One is that I experienced a dictatorship, and so for me, I remember dreaming about democracy and dreaming about the freedoms that democracy mean, that for people who are born and grew up in a democracy, it's like air. They take it for granted. They don't realize that it can be taken away fairly quickly, fairly easily. And the autocrats who are talking the language of inclusion of my kin and exclusion of those who are not my kin, if you are in the included kin, you might think, I'm fine, I'm safe, I'm protected. But boy, they will come after you after a while. And there are many historical examples of that. And it's very difficult to impart this experience to students of mine, for example, in Canada, who were born in and grew up in a very pluralistic democracy that is still a good country. And so it's not easy to tell them that this is something that you should not take for granted. Yes, it has to remain a dream. Of course, it cannot be something that's throbbing in your chest all the time, that today for lunch I'm going to protect democracy. but it's something that I think we have to be aware of, especially looking at other countries and people who are living in non-free countries.
I have to be a little bit pessimistic here because I think what's happening now in the world, that you need to go to the roots and start to explain what democracy is and what it is not, and what it can do and what it cannot. Because we see that in some countries, I mean, first there is a narrative coming to China that this is only the Western perception of what democracy is. It doesn't have to be like that. It can be something else. So it doesn't need to have like free and fair elections and all that. Like any participation from the citizens is already a democracy. And then the second thing is that, and this is, for example, Zambia is one example where we see this fight is going on, because sometimes they mistake democracy for, say, delivering of economic goods or something. And that's, again, kind of, it's not a miracle that will solve all the problems that we have in the society, but it is valuable per se. And it is also a tool to achieve many of the things. But it has to go back to this education of what democracy is. And this is something I feel that we have lost this discussion also now in the society about, we stop talking about the value of democracy as such.
Yeah, much has been already said, but maybe a couple of things. I mean, again, if the dream is democracy, I mean, of course, a few years ago, we would have answered ourselves, look, the dream has been achieved. Once you achieve the dream, why the dream, you know, is not a dream anymore, it's a reality. Now, the point is that, I mean, as it has already been said, I think that the only way to keep democracy alive and work is to keep dreaming about democracy, because, again, democracy is not a picture, it's a movie. And again, as we have seen from the chart, democracy can very much, let's say, go down. Now, I think that there are two things still to bear in mind. The first one is obviously this idea of not taking for granted. I mean, in my academic life, I teach European integration, which I think, by the way, is one of the main factors that contribute to keep democracy alive in this context. But okay, and one of the things that I tell my students is that, look, European integration has primarily brought peace. And, you know, as you said, well, look, to the generation of my grandparents, peace meant a lot because they experienced war. To many of my students in class, they have no idea of what the contrary of peace means. They have no idea of what war means. Now, sadly and tragically, we have seen, not very far from us, what war means and what the absence of peace implies. And sadly, we have also seen in countries that we took for granted how democracy that was there is very much declining. So the moment in which citizens are exposed to examples not too far away from themselves of what it means, let's say, to lose something, they might also become more attached to that something before losing it. But for this to happen, it also means that we need to give democracy not just, let's say, the essence of a dream, but also a clear connotation. Again, not just an empty shell, but democracy meaning something. And this, I think, is where, again, the organized civil society, the political elites that have to be held accountable, have to put meanings inside democracy, and people and citizens need to feel that it's worth standing for those values that very much affect the quality of your life. If these two things don't happen at the same time, I think that, yes, I would also be fairly negative and pessimistic. But let's hope that these two things, let's say, happen one with the other.
Let's do hope indeed. So we've come to the end of this panel session, and I want to inspire you to keep thinking about this question, the issues that were raised here by the panelists. I think we've shown how democracy can be and should be a dream, and at the same time how it is very much a societal choice as well. But the how of it is what we're faced with daily and should be faced daily. So I'm inviting you to give a warm round of thank you to the panel here.